Of course. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining your original articulate and narrative-driven style while slightly altering the word order and sentence structure. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. In hushed, fearful tones, the German immigrant community of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whispered about 11-year-old Emma Richter during the winter of 1873. This child was pale and quiet, capable of memorizing entire conversations word for word after hearing them just once. She could calculate the day of the week for any date in human history within seconds and recite the precise number of steps between any two buildings in her neighborhood. To the people of 1873, what modern science might recognize as an extraordinary neurological condition was either a divine blessing or something far more sinister. But the community's amazement turned to terror when Emma began using her remarkable abilities to predict deadly accidents, reveal buried secrets, and recite intimate details of crimes that supposedly no living person had witnessed. 3 men would be dead by spring. A family would flee in the night, and Emma Richter herself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a leather journal filled with numbers that no one dared to decode. Before we continue with the dark secrets uncovered by Emma Richter's extraordinary mind in Milwaukee's German Quarter and her chilling story, make sure to hit that notification bell and subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you the most haunting historical mysteries. Let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happened in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. What the residents of Brewery Town didn't realize was that a web of lies, betrayal, and murder, carefully hidden for nearly a decade, would be exposed by Emma's gift. Her mathematical precision would become the most terrifying nightmare their community had ever faced. A bustling enclave of red brick breweries and modest wooden homes was Milwaukee's German Quarter in 1873, with the constant sound of German voices mixing with English in the crisp Wisconsin air. Their own little Bavaria had been built along the shores of Lake Michigan by this community of nearly 8,000 German immigrants, complete with beer gardens, traditional bakeries, and the familiar rhythms of old-world life transplanted to American soil. While their wives tended gardens that yielded the same vegetables their grandmothers had grown in the Rhineland, the men worked in the breweries, Schlitz, Best, and the dozens of smaller operations that made Milwaukee famous. Their infant daughter, Emma, accompanied Heinrich and Greta Richter, who had arrived from Bavaria in 1861 with dreams of prosperity. Steady work as a brew master at the Kellner Brewery, a mid-sized operation that supplied beer to the growing city's thirsty population, was found by Heinrich. To supplement their income, Greta took in laundry and mending, her nimble fingers working by candlelight long after Emma had been put to bed in their small but tidy home on Galena Street. In every way except for their daughter, the Richters were unremarkable. So small that the ship's doctor doubted she would survive the journey, Emma had been born during the harsh Atlantic crossing, 3 weeks premature. But survive she did, though she remained slight and pale with enormous grey eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unsettling intensity. Rarely crying or demanding attention as a toddler, she was content to sit quietly in corners, watching and listening as the adult world unfolded around her. Something unusual was begun to be noticed by Emma's parents by age 4. Entire conversations she had overheard days earlier, complete with the precise inflections and accents of the speakers, could be recited by her. Everything was counted by her. The steps from their front door to the bakery, the number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the exact time between the brewery whistles that mark the beginning and end of each workday. With frightening speed, she absorbed mathematical concepts when Heinrich taught her basic arithmetic, solving problems in her head faster than he could work them out on paper. A mixture of pride and unease was how the German community initially viewed Emma's abilities. Whenever Emma's calculating grey eyes fixed on her, old Mrs. Brennan, who claimed to remember the witch trials in her grandmother's stories, crossed herself. But Emma's gifts were declared to be a blessing from God by Father Koller, the stout Bavarian priest who served their small Catholic parish, a child chosen to demonstrate divine wisdom in their New World community. Particularly harsh had been the winter of 1872, with temperatures dropping so low that Lake Michigan froze solid for the first time in a generation. While their wives struggled to keep their families warm and fed through the long, bitter months, the brewery workers huddled around coal stoves, their breath visible even indoors. It was during this isolated winter that a darker character began to be taken on by Emma's abilities, though no one yet understood what was coming. The habit of sitting by the small window in their kitchen had been developed by Emma, watching the neighbors go about their daily routines with the same intense focus she applied to mathematical problems. Not just in numbers, but in human behavior, she began to notice patterns. Always walking to the brewery by the same route, taking exactly 247 steps, was Mr. Kruger, except on Wednesdays when he took a different path that required 284 steps. In a specific sequence, Mrs. Fisher hung her laundry, but when her husband worked late at the mill, the order was changed by her completely. These observations might have been dismissed as the quirks of an unusual child, except that Emma began to vocalize her findings in ways that made the adults increasingly uncomfortable. On a grey February morning in 1873, the transformation from curiosity to dread began. While her mother prepared her father's lunch pail, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, methodically eating her breakfast when she suddenly looked up and announced, "Mr. Dietrich will not come home from the brewery today. At exactly 14 minutes past 2 o'clock, he will die." The tin pail she was holding was nearly dropped by Greta. "Emma, mind God, what a terrible thing to say. Why would you think such a thing?" With that unsettling intensity, Emma's grey eyes remained fixed on her mother's face. For 17 days, he has been drinking from the small brown bottle. 3 times more than usual, he drank yesterday. His steps were uneven. 251 instead of his normal 244. Within 72 hours, something significant happens when people change their patterns by more than 10%. By 12%, Mr. Dietrich's pattern changed. The calculation is simple. Staring at his daughter, Hinrich, who had been putting on his heavy wool coat, stopped. Indeed, a drinker was young Dietrich, but no more than half the men in the German quarter. Disturbing enough was the idea that Emma had been counting his steps and tracking his drinking habits, but a chill through both parents was sent by her calm mathematical certainty about his death that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin winter. "You must not say such things, Emma," Hinrich said firmly. "It's not proper for a child to speak of death." Simply nodding and returning to her breakfast was what Emma did, but worried glances were exchanged by her parents over her bent head. To their daughter's unusual observations, they had grown accustomed, but this felt different, darker, and more specific than her typical mathematical pronouncements. That afternoon, at precisely 14 minutes past 2, young Dietrich collapsed in the brewery's malt room. Heart failure brought on by what Dr. Mer determined to be chronic alcohol poisoning was the official cause of death. Noted by the brewery workers who found him was that he had been acting strangely for weeks, drinking more heavily than usual and showing signs of severe anxiety. But the timing was what truly unsettled them. Accurate to the minute had been Emma Richter's prediction. Through the German quarter like smoke from a chimney fire spread word of Emma's grim prophecy. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others remembered the pale girl with the calculating eyes and began to wonder what else she might have observed during her silent vigils at the kitchen window. The subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances when they walked to church or visited the market was what the Richter family found themselves. Less certain now seemed Father Koller, who had previously praised Emma's gifts as divine. Seeking guidance about his daughter's disturbing prediction, when Hinrich approached him after Sunday Mass, the priest's jovial demeanor had been replaced by something approaching concern. "My friend, Hinrich," Father Koller said, his Bavarian accent thick with worry. "Perhaps it would be best if young Emma spent less time watching the neighbors and more time with her prayers. Yes, the Lord gives us gifts, but sometimes the devil can twist even the most innocent abilities toward darker purposes." Deeply troubled was Hinrich by this suggestion. A practical man he had always been, more concerned with the science of brewing than the mysteries of faith. But the unsettling accuracy of Emma's prediction could not be dismissed by even him. For a serious conversation, he sat his daughter down that evening. "Emma, you must tell me the truth. How did you know about Mr. Dietrich?" With those enormous grey eyes, Emma looked at her father, her expression as calm and analytical as always. "I watch, I count, I remember." In predictable ways, Mr. Dietrich's behavior changed. Cardiac stress becomes inevitable when someone increases their alcohol consumption by 37% over a 17-day period while simultaneously reducing their food intake by approximately 20%. Based on his age, weight, and observed symptoms, I calculated the most probable time of failure. Cold ran his blood as Heinrich felt it. Like a physician, or something far more troubling was how his 11-year-old daughter was speaking. "But Emma, how could you know all these details about Mr. Dietrich's eating and drinking?" "I observe everything, Papa, every day, every person, every pattern." Matter-of-fact remained Emma's voice, but there was something in her eyes that made Heinrich deeply uncomfortable. "Would you like me to tell you about the other calculations I've made?" Quickly, Heinrich shook his head. About their neighbors' lives and deaths, what else his daughter had calculated, he did not want to know. But as he tucked Emma into bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his family was standing at the edge of something much darker than a simple mathematical curiosity. Outside their small house, the February snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the German quarter and creating an insulated world where secrets could be hidden and observations could be made without detection. Quietly in her narrow bed lay Emma, her mathematical mind processing the day's data and calculating probabilities that number 11-year-old should be able to comprehend, and certainly number 11-year-old should want to know. Like the wind off Lake Michigan shifted the atmosphere in Milwaukee's German quarter in the weeks following young Dietrich's death. Her daily observations were continued by Emma. But with growing unease, her parents now watched her as she sat by the kitchen window, her grey eyes tracking the movements of their neighbors with mechanical precision. A source of deep, knowing worry had become the child who had once been their pride. By necessity, the brewing community was tight-knit. For work, the men relied on each other, for companionship during the long winters, their wives, and together in the narrow streets between the red brick buildings, their children played. But into this social fabric, Emma had never quite fit. Alone, she preferred to sit, counting and calculating and watching the world around her with that unsettling intensity, while other children played games and told stories. More detailed and more disturbing were what Greta began to notice Emma's observations were becoming. Casually, the child would mention that for 6 weeks, Mrs. Weber had been meeting secretly with Mr. Kellner behind the brewery on Tuesday afternoons, or that every Sunday after church, the Schneider family had been burying something in their back garden. When Greta asked how Emma could possibly know such things, the girl would simply explain that she had observed the patterns and calculated the probabilities. "People think they are being secret," Emma said one March morning as she methodically buttered her bread. "But they follow patterns just like numbers." On Tuesday afternoons, Mrs. Weber always tells her husband she's visiting her sister, but she takes 127 steps to Mr. Kellner's house instead of 349 steps to her sister's. Exactly 73 centimeters apart in a grid pattern, the Schneiders bury objects wrapped in cloth. "They believe no one is watching, but I am always watching." Enough had been heard by Heinrich. About their daughter's increasingly troubling behavior, he spoke seriously with his wife that evening, after Emma was asleep. "Greta, this cannot continue. Unnatural is what Emma is becoming. Such things should not be observed by children, and so coldly, they certainly should not speak of them." Nodding was what Greta did, her hands trembling as she mended one of Heinrich's work shirts. "I'm frightened, Heinrich. Not of Emma, but of what people will think. Already the neighbors look at us strangely. When she saw me coming yesterday, Mrs. Brennan crossed the street. And he has not visited us since Yang's death, Father Collar." Justified proved their fears when 3 days later, another of her mathematical announcements was made by Emma. When she suddenly stopped peeling potatoes and looked up with that familiar calculating expression, she was helping her mother prepare dinner. "Discovered tomorrow at 11 in the morning will be Mrs. Weber. In the brewery office, her husband will find her with Mr. Kellner. There will be violence." Her paring knife was dropped by Greta. "Emma, *9*, you must not say such things." But with the same mathematical certainty she applied to her arithmetic lessons, Emma continued. "For 6 weeks, Mrs. Weber has been arriving at the brewery 7 minutes earlier each week. Each day, Mr. Kellner has been staying 33 minutes later. Tomorrow, 47 minutes early will be when Mr. Weber returns from his delivery route because her left front leg is developing lameness in his horse. For 11 days, I have observed her gait deteriorating. Inevitable makes the convergence of these 3 variables discovery. With dread, felt his chest tighten Heinrich, who had been listening from the doorway. Their neighbors, she was not just observing their daughter. With terrifying accuracy, she was predicting their futures. Emma, how do you know about Mr. Weber's horse? When she passes our house, I count her steps. 53% of the time, on March 1st, she favored her right leg. 68% it was today. Severe enough to slow the delivery route by 47 minutes, causing Mr. Weber to return early. The lameness will be tomorrow. Exactly as Emma had calculated unfolded the next day. In a compromising position with brewery owner Ernst Kellner, Wilhelm VBER discovered his wife Anna. A broken nose and 3 cracked ribs were left in Kellner by the confrontation that followed, while so severely beaten was Anna that Dr. Müller had to be summoned. The tight-knit German community was rocked by the scandal. But the growing realization that little Emma Richter had somehow predicted the entire sequence of events was what disturbed people even more. Quickly through the neighborhood spread word. Not only young Dietrich's death had been predicted by the pale girl with the mathematical mind, but with unsettling precision, she had also foreseen the VBER Kellner scandal. About the strange child who sat at her window, watching and calculating and somehow knowing things that no child should know, people began to whisper. Increasingly isolated found themselves the Richter family. At church, former friends avoided them. From playing near their house, children were forbidden, and with barely concealed suspicion, even the shopkeepers in the German quarter began to treat them. Tenuous became Heinrich's position at the brewery. With unease, his fellow workers viewed him, and clear it was made by Ernst Kellner, still recovering from his beating, that no longer welcome at company social events was the Richter family. To the growing hostility around her, Emma seemed oblivious. Her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with mechanical precision, she continued her daily observations. A leather journal she began keeping, filling its pages with numbers, dates, and observations that her parents dared not read. With a dread they could not name, filled them the sight of their 11-year-old daughter bent over her calculations, writing in neat columns of figures. As winter gave way to spring, the isolation deepened. Now hostile and threatening seemed the German quarter that had once felt like home. The unthinkable began to be considered by Heinrich, leaving Milwaukee, abandoning the life they had built, and starting over somewhere far from the whispers and the fear and the terrible accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But with her calculations, Emma was not finished. The worst was yet to come, and the data that would lead to the darkest secrets of all had already been begun processing by her mathematical mind. In Milwaukee, as April arrived, bringing with it the first tentative warmth after the brutal winter, thicker with her precise notations grew Emma's journal. Her constant companion had become the leather-bound book, and with increasingly complex calculations that went far beyond simple mathematics, she filled its pages. Of charts tracking human behavior patterns, tables of numerical sequences they couldn't understand, and detailed maps of the German quarter marked with symbols and measurements, her parents caught glimpses. In more concrete ways had begun to manifest the community's fear of Emma. From walking past the Richter house, children were forbidden. Quickly and without conversation, shopkeepers served the family, and to formal church services, even Father Koller had begun limiting his interactions with them. But Emma's isolation only seemed to sharpen her observational skills, as if the removal of normal social distractions allowed her unusual mind to focus more intently on the mathematical patterns she perceived in human behavior. Increasingly curious about Emma's abilities had grown Dr. Friedrich Müller, the community's physician. Unlike the superstitious whispers of the neighbors, with scientific interest, Dr. Müller approached the situation. In Berlin before immigrating to America, he had studied medicine and had encountered cases of unusual mental capabilities in his practice. When Heinrich Richter approached him privately, seeking medical advice about his daughter's condition, to examine Emma, Dr. Müller agreed. On a rainy Thursday morning in Dr. Miller's office above the pharmacy on Water Street, the examination took place. With the same mathematical precision she applied to everything else, Emma submitted to the doctor's questions and tests, answering each inquiry with detailed accuracy, while her grey eyes remained fixed on some invisible calculation. "Emma," Dr. Mailer said in his accented English, "your father tells me you can predict when certain events will happen. Can you explain to me how you do this?" With that unsettling intensity, Emma looked at the doctor. I observe patterns and calculate probabilities based on established behavioral data. Mathematical sequences are what people believe their actions are random, but they follow. With high accuracy, I can predict future behavior when I have sufficient data points. Intrigued despite himself, Dr. Mueller leaned forward. Can you give me an example? Through pages of neat numerical notations, Emma consulted her journal, flipping. A secret, Mrs. Brennan believes she is keeping, but quite obvious is her pattern. For 8 weeks, every Tuesday and Friday, she has walked to the church at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. But she continues to the rectory and remains for precisely 43 minutes instead of entering for prayer. Changed has also Father Kerr's pattern. Extra candles and wine, he has been purchasing, and by an average of 17 minutes on Tuesdays and Fridays, his evening prayers have extended. Statistically significant is the correlation. His breath catch felt Dr. Mueller. Scandalous enough were the implications of what Emma was suggesting about the priest and the widow, but deeply troubling was the methodical way she had documented her observations. Emma, how long have you been watching people in this way? Always, Emma replied simply. Since I was very small, but I only began making calculations when I learned mathematics. Clearer then became the patterns. With Heinrich and Greta Richter, Dr. Mueller spoke privately after the examination. That Emma's condition was neurological rather than supernatural was told to him by his medical training, but for understanding what he had observed, he had no framework. Differently than other children's works your daughter's mind, he explained. In ways that seem almost mechanical, she processes information. A medical condition, in my opinion, this is, not the other things people are saying. But the growing dread that surrounded Emma's predictions couldn't be diminished by even Dr. Mueller's scientific perspective. After his examination, 2 days later, another of her calculated announcements was made by Emma. On Sunday evening, there will be a fire at the Zimmerman house. At 8:47, it will start and spread to 3 adjacent buildings before the volunteer fire brigade can respond. Not survive will Mr. Zimmerman. The familiar chill that accompanied his daughter's predictions felt Heinrich. Emma, you must not say such things. How could you possibly know about a fire? Her journal was consulted by Emma. For 12 days, Mr. Zimmerman has been drinking lamp oil mixed with whiskey. In quantities that exceed normal household use, I observed him purchasing both items. Which follows the pattern of wives leaving before significant domestic incidents occur. His wife left for Chicago to visit her sister yesterday. That I calculated based on the angle of smoke emission and the pattern of soot deposits. Structural damage has the chimney on their house. 93% is the probability of fire. Softly, Greta began to weep. More than any supernatural explanation would have, frightened her the clinical way Emma discussed potential tragedy, as if human suffering were simply another mathematical problem to be solved. The cold precision in Emma's voice or the mechanical way she processed human pain, she no longer recognized, but this was her child. That would haunt him for the rest of his life. A decision was made by Heinrich. About Emma's prediction, he decided to warn Franz Zimmermann, hoping that preventive action might save a life and perhaps demonstrate that for good rather than simply predicting disaster could be used his daughter's calculations. At the brewery Saturday evening, stumbling drunken, reeking of the lamp oil Emma had mentioned, he found Zimmermann. With belligerent laughter and crude jokes about the devil child who thinks she knows everything, was met Heinrich's warning. But because he promised to be extra careful with the lamps, something in Heinrich's desperation must have penetrated Zimmermann's alcoholic haze. With unseasonable warmth and a dry wind from the west, arrived Sunday evening. From the Zimmerman house, flames erupted at exactly 8:47. Consuming not just the original building, but 3 adjacent homes before the volunteer fire brigade could mount an effective response, the fire spread with terrifying speed. In his kitchen, where he had apparently fallen while trying to extinguish flames that had spread far beyond his ability to control, was found Brand Zimmermann's body. Through the German quarter sent shock waves the accuracy of Emma's prediction down to the exact minute. By several brewery workers had been witnessed Heinrich's attempt to warn Zimmermann, and that Emma had predicted not just the fire, but its precise timing and consequences, spread word quickly. Into open fear transformed the community's unease, and completely ostracized found themselves the RTOR family. But for Emma, simply another data point to be recorded in her journal was the fire. Based on the observed variables, she noted the correlation between her prediction and the actual event, made adjustments to her calculations, and with the same mechanical precision that had made her prediction possible in the first place, began processing new patterns. That she was not finished calculating was the worst part. Into a place of whispered fears and sideways glances transformed the German quarter the days following the Zimmermann fire. Too precise, too detailed, and too accurate to be dismissed as coincidence had been Emma's prediction. The Brons, the Kohlers, and the Steiners, 3 families had lost their homes in the blaze, and while trying to process the unsettling reality of Emma's mathematical prophecies, the community was struggling to house the displaced families. Untenable had become his position at the brewery, found Heinrich. Him, his fellow workers avoided. When he entered a room, conversation stopped and clear it was made by Ernst Kellner, still bearing the marks of Wilhelm VBR's attack, that in any brewery social functions, no longer welcome was the Richter family's presence. From a curiosity into something the community feared to name had their daughter been transformed by the mathematical precision of Emma's predictions. Of the growing hostility around her, Emma herself seemed unaware. With calculations that grew increasingly complex and disturbing, she continued her daily observations, filling page after page of her leather journal. What appeared to be probability matrices she had begun creating, tracking multiple variables simultaneously, and generating predictions that extended weeks into the future. Afraid to look at her daughter's journal found herself Greta, terrified of what calculations Emma might be making about their own family or neighbors. A source of constant anxiety had become the child who had once been her greatest joy. All contributed to a growing sense that something fundamental had been lost or damaged in her daughter's mind. Emma's matter-of-fact discussions of human tragedy, her clinical observations about people's most private behaviors, and her mechanical processing of information that should have evoked emotional responses. On a Tuesday morning in late April, came the breaking point. With her characteristic intensity, Emma was sitting at her usual place by the kitchen window, watching the street activity when she suddenly looked up at her mother with those calculating grey eyes. "Mama, there is something wrong with the pattern today." Who was preparing bread for baking? Greta felt her hands begin to tremble. "What do you mean, Emma?" With practiced efficiency, Emma consulted her journal, flipping through pages of numerical notations. For 11 weeks, every Tuesday, Mrs. Brennan has walked to the rectory at exactly 3:15. But today, at 2:47, she left her house and walked toward the river instead. Significant distress is indicated by her behavior. By 12% decreased her step length and irregular was her breathing pattern. Something final, this suggests she is planning. With horror filled Greta the clinical way Emma discussed Mrs. Brennan's apparent suicidal intentions. "Emma, you must not speak of such things. A good woman is Mrs. Brennan. She would never, 87% is the mathematical probability," Emma interrupted with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "Typically execute irreversible decisions within 4 hours of the pattern change, people who dramatically alter established behavioral patterns while displaying physical signs of distress. 43 minutes ago, changed Mrs. Brennan's pattern." Tilting around her felt Greta the world. More than she could bear was the realization that her 11-year-old daughter was calmly predicting a neighbor's suicide with mathematical precision. To find Heinrich, who was in their small garden behind the house trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of preparing soil for spring planting, she dropped her bread dough and ran. "Heinrich, you must come quickly. Mrs. Brennan is going to harm herself," says Emma. "We must do something." At his wife's terrified face looked Heinrich and felt the familiar dread that had become their constant companion. Still sitting by the window, making additional notations in her journal as if recording a scientific observation rather than predicting a human tragedy, they found Emma. "Emma, tell me exactly what you observed about Mrs. Brennan." From her calculations, Emma looked up. By 28 minutes, she deviated from her established Tuesday pattern. Severe emotional distress was suggested by her physical indicators. 87% is the probability of self-harm, based on historical data about behavioral pattern disruption. Between 5 and 7 this evening, with peak likelihood occurring. Both his desperation and his growing acceptance of Emma's abilities revealed a decision made by Heinrich. Immediately, he left the house and went searching for Margaret Brennan, following the route toward the river that Emma had indicated. On the dock where the fishing boats tied up, staring into the dark water with an expression of profound despair, he found the elderly widow. "Mrs. Brennan," Hinrich called softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. "Are you all right?" Toward him turned the elderly woman, her eyes red with tears. "Hinrich, what are you doing here? I was concerned about you. Troubled lately, you seem." Crumbled was Mrs. Brennan's face. "Any more, I cannot bear it, Hinrich. The shame, the whispers, the knowledge that everyone knows about my weakness. Sin, it is, says Father Koller, but for him, what I feel, I cannot help. Better to end it than to live with this disgrace." With growing horror realized Hinrich that accurate had been Emma's observations about Mrs. Brennan and Father Koller, and that indeed contemplating suicide was the elderly woman rather than face the scandal. Away from the river, talking Margaret Brennan, convincing her that shame was not worth dying for and that eventually would fade the community's judgment, he spent the next 2 hours. Making final notations in her journal, he found Emma when he returned home that evening. With her plan, Mrs. Brennan did not follow through, she observed clinically. The probability calculation was changed by the intervention. For future predictions involving third-party interference, I will need to adjust my variables. In disbelief, Hinrich stared at his daughter. A suicide attempt that had not yet occurred had been somehow observed and calculated by Emma. And now, as simply another data point to be incorporated into her mathematical models, she was treating his intervention. That his 11-year-old daughter was not just predicting tragic events, but studying human suffering with scientific detachment filled him with a horror he could not name the realization. That would change their lives forever. A decision was made by Hinrich and Greta that night. In Milwaukee, they could not continue living. Whatever they were, Emma's abilities had made their life in the German Quarter impossible. But more troubling was the growing realization that their daughter was not just observing and calculating human behavior, but seemed to be losing touch with the emotional reality of the tragedies she predicted. To leave Wisconsin, to find someplace where Emma could live without being feared, and where her unusual mind might find a different outlet, they began making quiet plans. But with her calculations, Emma was not finished, and yet to come were the most disturbing revelations. Awake that night lay Hinrich, listening to the sounds of the German Quarter settling into sleep. He could not shake the feeling that his daughter's mathematical mind had uncovered secrets that went far deeper than adultery and suicide attempts. All suggested that Emma had been watching and recording far more than anyone realized, the precision of her observations, the clinical way she discussed human tragedy, and the growing complexity of her calculations. And that she was still calculating was the most terrifying part. On the first day of May 1873, came the revelation that would expose the darkest secret of Milwaukee's German Quarter. In her journal, Emma had been making increasingly complex calculations, creating elaborate charts that tracked the movements and behaviors of virtually every adult in their community. In preparation for leaving Wisconsin, hoping to escape before Emma's next prediction could destroy more lives, her parents had begun packing their belongings. But that morning, as spring sunlight streamed through their kitchen window, an announcement was made by Emma that would shake the very foundations of their community. "Papa," she said, looking up from her journal with those calculating gray eyes. "Something important I need to show you. A pattern that explains everything has been revealed by my calculations." Who had been dreading this moment for weeks, Hinrich reluctantly sat down across from his daughter. To a section filled with detailed charts, maps, and numerical sequences that looked more like the work of a trained investigator than an 11-year-old child, Emma opened her journal. "Of 43 adults in our community, for 26 months, I have been observing and recording the behavior patterns," Emma began with her characteristic clinical precision. "Random variations, I initially believed the patterns were. But when I analyzed the data systematically, correlations that indicate organized criminal activity were discovered by me." Cold felt his blood run Hinrich. "Emma, what are you saying?" With the methodical precision of a mathematics professor, Emma consulted her charts. "In the basement of Kellner's Brewery, 7 men in our community have been meeting secretly every Wednesday at midnight. Based on observed deviations from normal behavior, timing inconsistencies in their stated activities, and physical evidence of their gatherings, I calculated their movement patterns. To a detailed map of the German quarter marked with symbols and measurements, she pointed. On Wednesday nights, Mr. Steinberg tells his wife he works late, but at exactly the same time as the other 6 men, he leaves the mill and to the brewery using a route that avoids the main streets. He walks. For 26 months, the pattern has been consistent, with only 3 exceptions that correlated with illness or family emergencies. At the map, stared Hinrich, recognizing the names Emma had marked. Wilhelm VBER, Franz Kellner, Ernst's brother, Hans Zimmermann, Franz's cousin, Otto Steinberg, Klaus Brennan, Margaret's deceased husband until 3 months ago, Gustav Wolf, and Hermann Kruger. Emma, about secret meetings, how could you possibly know? Everything I observe, Papa, every night, every movement, every deviation from established patterns. To another page filled with numerical calculations, Emma turned. But the most significant discovery are not the meetings. Systematic theft from the brewery operations, with estimated losses of approximately $47,000 over 26 months, my calculations indicate these 7 men have been involved in. To tremble began Hinrich's hands. More money than most families in the German quarter would see in a lifetime represented the sum Emma mentioned. How could you calculate such a thing? With the same mathematical precision she applied to all her observations, was delivered Emma's explanation. Between the reported beer production figures and the actual output I calculated based on observed deliveries, ingredients purchased, and waste disposal patterns, I noticed discrepancies. Systematic theft was indicated by the difference, but I needed to identify the perpetrators. To detailed charts tracking the behavior patterns of the 7 men, she pointed. Of increased spending that did not correlate with their reported incomes, consistent patterns were shown by these individuals all. Approximately $300 worth of new furniture was purchased by Mr. Weber. To relatives in Germany, money was sent by Mr. Steinberg. At the post office 12 times with packages too large for normal correspondence, I observed him. Across all 7 men, the pattern was consistent. At evidence of a criminal conspiracy that his 11-year-old daughter had uncovered through her obsessive observations and mathematical analysis, realized Hinrich he was looking. But with her revelations, Emma was not finished. Inside knowledge of brewery security and access to the financial records were required by the theft operation, Emma continued. The involvement of someone in management was indicated by my calculations. As the organizer of the theft ring, the patterns pointed to Ernst Kellner himself. Like a physical blow hit Hinrich the final piece of Emma's revelation. The brewery owner who had been gradually freezing them out of the community, Ernst Kellner, was allegedly the mastermind of a major theft operation involving 7 men from their neighborhood. To a truth that was both incredible and terrifying, all pointed, the precision of Emma's analysis, the mathematical certainty of her conclusions, and the detailed evidence she had compiled through months of observation. Very serious accusations are these, Emma. Of your calculations, are you certain? One final time, Emma consulted her journal. 96% is the mathematical probability. But Papa, something else there is. Something that explains why Mr. Kellner has been trying to isolate our family from the community. With dread, felt his chest tighten Hinrich. What do you mean? That I observe everything, knows Mr. Kellner. Watching me watch him, he has been. As if calculating whether I might have discovered his secret, 3 weeks ago, twice at night, he approached our house and stood outside for 17 minutes each time. That I know about the theft operation, his behavior indicates he suspects. With a terror he had never experienced, filled Hinrich the realization that Emma's mathematical abilities had not only uncovered a criminal conspiracy, but had also made her a target. With those unsettling grey eyes, Emma closed her journal and looked at her father. Papa, in significant danger, we are, indicate my calculations. To continue making observations, Mr. Kellner and the others cannot allow me. 84% is the mathematical probability of them taking action against our family. Within the next 72 hours, with peak likelihood occurring. That Emma's final prediction was not about fire or suicide or adultery, but about their own family's survival, understood Hinrich. A truth that made their continued existence in Milwaukee impossible had been uncovered by her mathematical mind, and the one witness who could destroy them all, the men she had exposed, would not hesitate to eliminate. That would save his family's life. A decision was made by Hinrich that evening. Using the detailed evidence Emma had compiled in her journal, under cover of darkness, he approached Dr. Mueller and shared Emma's discoveries. By the mathematical precision of her criminal investigation, was stunned the physician, who had already been disturbed by Emma's unusual abilities. Hinrich, true is what Emma has calculated. We are looking at the largest theft operation in Milwaukee's history, Dr. Mueller whispered as he examined the journal by lamplight in his office. But more importantly, in mortal danger is your family if Kellner suspects that Emma knows. To help them escape Milwaukee immediately, agreed Dr. Mueller. Using his medical connections, for Heinrich to receive an emergency job offer at a brewery in distant Minnesota, providing cover for their sudden departure, he arranged. Before Emma's 72-hour prediction could come to pass, they would leave that very night. As the RTOR family loaded their few belongings into Dr. Mueller's wagon under cover of darkness, one final observation was made by Emma that would haunt Hinrich for the rest of his life. Papa, through other means, in approximately 6 months, the theft operation will be discovered. Justice, Mr. Kellner will face, but 3 of the 7 men will not survive the investigation. Quite clear are the mathematical probabilities. Into the wagon, shuddered as he lifted his daughter Hinrich. The future consequences of the conspiracy she had uncovered, Emma was calculating even as they fled for their lives. In every detail, her prediction would prove accurate. By winter, a federal investigation would expose the theft ring. Arrested and convicted would be Ernst Kellner, and under suspicious circumstances that were never fully explained, 3 of his accomplices would die. But on that dark May night in 1873, as their wagon rolled through the sleeping streets of Milwaukee's German Quarter, Hinrich could only think about how his daughter's extraordinary mathematical mind had both saved their lives and destroyed the only home they had ever known in America. From Milwaukee in the early hours of May 2, 1873, vanished the Richter family, leaving behind only whispered stories and unanswered questions. That they had received an emergency family summons back to Bavaria, reported Dr. Mueller, but to confirm their departure from America, no ship passenger records could be found, noted the few people who bothered to ask. What was never learned by the residents of the German Quarter was that to Minnesota had indeed traveled Heinrich, Greta, and Emma Richter, where at a small brewery in the town of New Ulm, work was found by Heinrich. To keep their location secret, had sworn Dr. Mueller. Understanding that for those who feared exposure of their secrets, Emma's mathematical abilities would always make her a target. In New Ulm, a new life far from the whispers and fears that had driven them from Milwaukee, attempted to build the Richter family. Familiar and satisfying found Hinrich the brewery work, while the domestic routines that had been shattered by Emma's disturbing predictions slowly began to rebuild Greta. But unchanged remained Emma herself. With the same mechanical precision that had made her both famous and feared, her mathematical mind continued to observe, calculate, and record human behavior patterns. With the family for several months, maintained correspondence Dr. Mueller, reporting that with a mathematics professor at a nearby college who was fascinated by her unusual abilities, Emma had begun working. From a scientific rather than supernatural perspective, approached Emma's condition the professor, a German immigrant named Dr. Hermann Weiss, helping her understand and channel her observational skills in ways that might prove beneficial rather than destructive. But in November of 1873, came the most significant revelation when a letter from Heinrich containing Emma's final prediction about the Milwaukee theft operation was received by Dr. Mueller. As she had calculated with mathematical precision, indeed uncovered had been Ernst Kellner's conspiracy by federal investigators. Of embezzling over $50,000 from multiple brewery operations, Kellner was arrested and convicted. Under circumstances that were ruled a suicide, but which many suspected were something far more sinister, was found dead in his home. Wilhelm Weber, who had been Kellner's primary accomplice. Within weeks of the investigation's conclusion, also died Otto Steinberg and Hermann Kruger. Steinberg in what appeared to be a drunken accident. And Kruger from what, doctor? Mueller diagnosed as a sudden heart attack that bore suspicious similarities to the symptoms of certain poisons. In every detail, accurate had been Emma's mathematical analysis of the criminal conspiracy, including her prediction that not all of the conspirators would survive the eventual discovery of their crimes. What Heinrich had come to understand about his daughter's extraordinary and terrifying abilities confirmed the precision of her calculations, even from hundreds of miles away and months in advance. From the scandal and tragedy of 1873, slowly recovered the German quarter of Milwaukee. Unwelcome attention from federal authorities was brought by the brewery theft investigation, but a level of corruption that had been quietly damaging the community for years, it also exposed. Into the houses left empty by death and departure moved new families, and around more honest foundations, gradually rebuilt itself the tight-knit community. But part of the neighborhood's whispered folklore became the story of Emma Richter, the pale girl with the calculating gray eyes, who could predict death and expose secrets through mathematical observation. About the dangers of knowing too much, parents used her story to warn their children, while what other secrets might be hiding behind the ordinary facades of their neighbors' lives, adults quietly wondered. Who had initially blessed Emma's abilities as divine gifts, Father Koller later confessed to Dr. Maller that in ways he could not explain, the girl's mathematical predictions had shaken his faith. Whether some knowledge was too dangerous for human minds to possess, had the priest begun to question, and whether a blessing or a curse that had been visited upon their community was represented by Emma's condition. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, in Milwaukee's German quarter intensifies the horror. With a friend who loves dark mysteries, share this video if this story is giving you chills. To support our content, hit that like button, and to never miss stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. In the most disturbing historical cases America has to offer, let's discover together what happens next. In the spring of 1874, nearly a year after their departure from Milwaukee, was written Dr. Mueller's final letter to the RTOR family. In it, he reported that to normal had largely returned the German quarter, but that in whispered conversations among the older residents, continued to circulate Emma's story. That had emerged during the federal investigation of the brewery theft. He also shared a disturbing development. That Emma's journal, which as evidence, Heinrich had left with Dr. Mueller, contained mathematical calculations that extended far beyond the immediate criminal conspiracy, had discovered government investigators. Throughout the entire German immigrant community, Emma had apparently been tracking and analyzing behavioral patterns, creating detailed profiles of dozens of families and predicting future events with remarkable accuracy. Both impressed and disturbed by the sophistication of Emma's observational methods were the federal investigators, trained in criminal analysis. In ways that professional investigators might envy, works your daughter's mind, Dr. Mueller wrote. But that she is far from Milwaukee, I confess that I am grateful. That I fear is too dangerous for any community to possess. A kind of knowledge is represented by the precision of her observations and the mathematical certainty of her predictions. From any historical record comes the final mention of Emma Richter in a brief notation in the New Ulm College Mathematics Department records from 1875. That his special student had demonstrated unprecedented abilities in statistical analysis and behavioral prediction, reported Professor Hermann Weiss, but that for personal reasons, her family had decided to relocate once again. From history as completely as she had vanished from Milwaukee on that dark night in May of 1873, after that entry, disappeared Emma Richter. What happened to the girl who could calculate human behavior with mathematical precision remains unknown. That families like the Richters possessing children with unusual abilities deliberately maintained their anonymity to protect themselves from both scientific exploitation and community persecution, have theorized some researchers. Where such abilities were recorded in sufficient detail to understand their scope and implications, Emma's story represents one of the few documented cases. That the human mind remains one of our greatest enigmas, capable of developing extraordinary abilities that challenge our understanding of intelligence, observation, and prediction, shows us this mystery. But modern science recognizes that conditions like savant syndrome, autism spectrum disorders, and hypothymesia can indeed create minds that process information in ways that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the neurological mechanisms involved. In 1873, Emma Richter's mathematical approach to human behavior was seen as either divine or demonic. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think Emma's abilities extended even further than what we discovered? Below, leave your comment and let us know if you've ever encountered someone with similar extraordinary mental abilities. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. That the most frightening truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right mind to calculate their terrible secrets, remind us these historical cases. That sometimes the most terrifying discoveries come not from supernatural forces, but from the relentless application of mathematical logic to human behavior, demonstrates the case of Emma Richter. In a world where we believe our secrets are safe, the existence of minds capable of such precise observation and calculation reminds us that privacy may be nothing more than an illusion, and that the patterns we think we hide may be visible to those who know how to look and how to count.